In the end, nobody left that room claiming a clear winner. 11 people watched Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris exchange techniques behind closed doors. And years later, those same witnesses would remember something unusual. Not a knockout, not an argument, not even a decisive victory. What stayed with them was the moment the atmosphere changed, when one of the world's most respected champions realized he was facing a man who approached combat in a completely different way. The details remained private. The stories rarely matched perfectly. But among those who were there, one memory appeared again and again, after only a few minutes. The sparring was no longer about who was stronger. It became something else entirely. By the time Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris came into the same martial arts circles, neither man needed an introduction. But they had arrived there by very different roads. Bruce Lee had spent years moving between worlds. Born in San Francisco and raised in Hong Kong, he had returned to the United States as a young man with an unusual combination of traditional training, physical experimentation, and an impatience with rigid systems. He was not interested in preserving a method simply because it had existed before him. He wanted to know whether it worked. That distinction would become increasingly important as his reputation grew. Lee's approach was built around direct observation. He studied how people moved when they were tired, surprised, pressured, or unable to perform a technique exactly as they had practiced it. His training became increasingly personal. Speed mattered, but so did timing. Technique mattered, but only if technique survived contact with another person. Chuck Norris had followed another path. Norris had served in the United States Air Force before beginning his competitive martial arts career. Through tournament competition, he developed a reputation for discipline, physical strength, and consistency. Unlike Lee, whose ideas were still evolving into a broader philosophy of combat, Norris had already established himself in the demanding world of competitive karate. He knew what it meant to face an opponent who was actively trying to defeat him. That difference mattered. One man was increasingly questioning the boundaries of martial arts systems. The other had spent years testing his abilities under competitive conditions. And yet, the two men recognized something familiar in one another. Their paths crossed through the Southern California martial arts community, where serious practitioners often moved through the same relatively small network of schools, tournaments, demonstrations, and private training sessions. Lee encountered Norris during this period, and what developed between them was not the simple rivalry that later retellings sometimes suggested. There was respect. Lee was impressed by Norris's kicking ability and competitive accomplishments. Norris, in turn, recognized that Lee possessed unusual speed, precision, and physical control. That mutual respect created the conditions for something more useful than a public contest. Training, the significance of their relationship did not come from one man humiliating the other. It came from the fact that both were already accomplished enough to have something worth protecting, and still curious enough to keep learning. That is where the story becomes difficult to separate from legend. Later accounts of Lee and Norris sparring together have often been retold with increasingly precise numbers, dramatic exchanges, and claims about exactly who witnessed what. Some details cannot be independently established, but the broader fact is much less mysterious. They trained together, and when two highly accomplished martial artists step onto the same floor, even an ordinary training session can reveal more than a public demonstration ever could. There is no audience to impress, only distance, timing, and the question every serious fighter eventually faces. What remains when the technique is no longer theoretical? That question would follow them into the private training sessions that later became part of the Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris legend. Chapter 2. The friendship behind the rivalry. The simplest version of the Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris story is that two famous fighters met, sparred, and discovered who was better. The history appears to be more complicated. There was competition in the martial arts world, certainly. Tournament reputations mattered. Schools competed for students. Fighters carried the expectations of the systems that had produced them. But Lee and Norris did not approach each other as strangers searching for an opponent to defeat. By the time they were training in the same Southern California circles, both had already established identities of their own. Norris had earned recognition through competition, and had become one of the strongest American representatives of traditional karate. His fighting was structured, disciplined, and shaped by years of tournament experience. Lee was moving in another direction. He had begun to question the limitations imposed by formal styles. He still valued technique, but increasingly looked at martial arts as something that had to remain responsive to the individual practitioner and the situation. That difference did not necessarily create hostility, it created curiosity. For Norris, training with Lee offered exposure to a man whose physical attributes were difficult to duplicate. Lee's speed was particularly noticeable. He could enter and leave distance quickly, change rhythm without warning, and deliver movements before an opponent had fully adjusted. For Lee, Norris represented something equally valuable. He was experienced, had fought serious opponents. He understood pressure. He knew how techniques behaved when another trained fighter was attempting to prevent them from working. That distinction was important to Lee. A technique demonstrated on a compliant partner could look perfect. Against resistance, the same technique could become difficult, slow, or useless. Norris provided resistance. So the relationship was not simply teacher and student, nor was it a rivalry in the conventional sense. It was closer to an exchange between two men who had developed different answers to some of the same questions. How close should you stand? When should you attack? How much movement is necessary? How much strength is actually required? And perhaps, most importantly, what happens when the opponent refuses to cooperate with your preferred method? These were questions that could not be settled by conversation. They had to be tested. This is where later retellings sometimes introduce a dramatic element, a secret match, a fixed number of witnesses, and a clearly defined winner. The surviving historical record does not establish every detail of such a contest with certainty. The often repeated claim that exactly 11 people witnessed a particular secret. The sparring match should therefore be treated cautiously, but that uncertainty does not erase the more substantial story. Lee and Norris did spar, and private sparring carried a different meaning from competition. There were no judges scoring points, no trophy waited at the end. There was no need to perform for an audience. A training partner could reveal weaknesses that a public opponent might never expose. That made trust essential. A fighter had to know that the other man would apply enough pressure to make the exercise meaningful without turning training into an attempt at injury. But this balance was especially important between accomplished practitioners. If either man held back too much, the session became useless. If either man pushed too far, it ceased to be training. The value existed somewhere between those extremes. Witnesses, who later remembered Lee's training environment, often described a similar quality: attention to small details, a slight change in distance, a different angle, a movement that seemed almost too economical to notice. Lee was fascinated by efficiency. He was not interested in adding movement merely because a traditional form required. If something could be accomplished with less motion, he wanted to understand why. Norris approached the same physical reality from a different background. His competitive experience had taught him that fundamentals survived for a reason. Balance, timing, conditioning, distance, and repetition were not philosophical concepts. They were practical necessities that made their training potentially useful to both men. Neither needed the other. To prove that he was a martial artist, they needed someone capable of showing them something they could not see alone, though, and that changes the meaning of the confrontation. The ring no longer becomes a stage, it becomes a laboratory. The important question is not who walks away with bragging rights, it is what each man notices during the exchange. For Lee, that meant observing how an accomplished karate fighter responded to unusual speed and changing angles. For Norris, it meant experiencing firsthand a style of movement that did not always follow the rhythm he had been trained to expect. That tension, if there was tension, came from uncertainty rather than hostility. Two experienced fighters knew that once contact began, theories would become physical realities. A stance either worked or it did not. A distance either protected you or exposed. YOUA. Technique either arrived in time or arrived too late, and neither man could completely control what the other would do. That was precisely why the training mattered. Years later, stories about Lee and Norris would often be reduced to a single question: who won? But that question may miss what made the relationship significant in the first place. They were not simply two men standing on opposite sides of a room. They represented two approaches developing during a period when martial arts in America was changing rapidly. One was becoming increasingly concerned with freedom from fixed patterns. The other had demonstrated the value of disciplined structure under competitive pressure. Their encounters, therefore, carried an unusual tension, not the tension of enemies, the tension of two highly skilled practitioners, discovering what happened when their ideas met another human being who could resist them. And eventually, behind closed doors and away from the noise of tournaments and demonstrations, that question would be tested more directly. There would be fewer spectators, fewer distractions, and a training floor where reputation meant considerably less than what happened in the next exchange. The story becomes more uncertain here. For decades, accounts of Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris training together have circulated through martial arts communities. Some versions describe private sessions. Others describe informal sparring among friends and students. Later retellings sometimes attach a precise number to the audience. Be 11 people? The numbers become part of the legend. But there's an important distinction between a story repeated for years and an event documented in contemporary records. There's no reliable evidence establishing that one specific secret sparring match between Lee and Norris was witnessed by exactly 11 people. What can be established is that Lee and Norris did train and spar, and that their relationship developed within a small martial arts community where private training sessions were common. That environment matters. These were not modern celebrity exhibitions, surrounded by cameras and official publicity. Much of martial arts training in Southern California during this period took place in relatively modest spaces, with instructors, students, and fellow practitioners moving between schools and private sessions. The atmosphere was practical. People came to train, they watched, they learned, and then they went home. That made reputation unusually fragile. A man could be famous outside the room and still discover that another experienced practitioner saw something he had missed. For Lee, this was not necessarily a problem. In fact, it was part of the reason he valued direct training. He was constantly examining movement. He watched how people stood, how they shifted weight, how they reacted when pressure arrived unexpectedly. He wanted combat to be functional rather than ceremonial. Norris had his own reasons for taking such training seriously. His tournament career had already demonstrated that controlled technique could survive genuine opposition. He understood timing, distance, and the importance of remaining composed when an opponent disrupted the expected rhythm. So when the two men trained/Niver entered the room as an unknown quantity, that was precisely what made the situation interesting. There was no need for an introduction. No one needed to explain what either man had accomplished. The people around them already knew. And when experienced fighters know one another's reputations, silence can become more revealing than conversation. The preparation for sparring is often uneventful. Gloves or protective equipment may be adjusted. The floor is cleared. People move toward the edges of the training space. The fighters measure the available distance without making an announcement of it. Nothing dramatic needs to happen. The anticipation comes from knowing that the next few minutes may expose things that ordinary demonstrations conceal. One of the first things a fighter notices is distance. Too far away, and an attack becomes obvious. Too close, and there may be no time to react. The correct distance is constantly changing. Lee was particularly attentive to this idea. His movements were often described by people who trained around him as economical. He did not appear interested in wasting energy simply to look impressive. His objective was to reach a useful position before the opponent fully understood what had changed. Norris, meanwhile, possessed the discipline of a seasoned competitor. His experience had taught him to read movement and maintain structure under pressure. That meant the first exchanges did not need to be dramatic. They could be almost quiet. A step, a feint, a change of angle, a reaction, then another adjustment. To someone unfamiliar with martial arts, such movements might appear insignificant. To experienced practitioners, they were the conversation. Every movement asked a question, every response provided an answer, and the most revealing answers were often the smallest ones. This is why the legend of a secret match can be misleading if it is imagined as a miniature championship fight. The significance of private sparring was not necessarily in whether one man knocked the other down. It was in what each man could learn while the exchange remained controlled. The witnesses, whoever precisely attended those sessions, would have seen something different from the spectacle later generations imagined. They would have seen concentration. They would have noticed that neither man needed to shout, that there was no requirement for intimidation. The authority came from competence. That distinction would become increasingly important as the session progressed, because once two fighters understand that the other man cannot simply be overwhelmed, the character of the exchange changes. Strength alone is insufficient. Speed alone is insufficient. Technique alone is insufficient. The fighter must adapt. That was one of the central ideas developing in Lee's thinking during these years. A martial artist could spend years perfecting a particular movement, but an opponent did not have to cooperate with that movement. Reality had no obligation to follow a lesson plan. The same principle applied to Norris. Competitive experience rewarded fighters who could maintain composure when an opponent changed the conditions. The strongest technique was not necessarily the most complicated one. It was the one that remained available when circumstances changed. That was the real test waiting inside the room. Not whether Bruce Lee could demonstrate speed, not whether Chuck Norris could demonstrate power. Both men already possessed those qualities. The question was, what happened when those qualities encountered each other? And as the sparring moved beyond the initial measurements of distance and timing, the people standing around the room would have had less reason to think about reputation. They would have been watching two practitioners solve the same problem from different directions. The room grew quieter. The exchanges became more deliberate, and whatever expectations the witnesses had brought with them began to give way to something more useful: observation. The legend would later remember a secret contest. The men inside the room were simply training, but sometimes history remembers a quiet training session, precisely because the people who witnessed it understood that they had seen something difficult to explain, and the real exchange had only just begun. There was no signal announcing the beginning. No referee stepped between them. No one called for the room to become quiet. Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris simply began moving. At first, the difference between preparation and actual sparring was almost impossible to identify. Both men were already accustomed to reading an opponent before committing to anything. A shift of the foot could change the distance. A slight movement of the shoulders could suggest an attack without becoming one. For an experienced fighter, those small details were enough. Lee's first advantage was not simply speed, it was timing. Speed describes how quickly a movement can travel. Timing determines when that movement begins. The distinction is easy to overlook. Until another fighter is standing in front of you, a technique can be extremely fast and still fail if it begins at the wrong moment. Lee understood this deeply. Rather than constantly attacking, he could use movement to make an opponent react first. Once a reaction appeared, even briefly, the available space changed. Norris understood the same principle from another direction. Years of competition had trained him to remain composed while an opponent attempted to disrupt his rhythm. He was not likely to abandon his structure, simply because someone moved quickly. That made the opening exchanges restrained. There was no reason to spend energy unnecessarily. Each man was gathering information. Lee watched Norris's stance. Norris watched Lee's movement. The observers watched both. For someone standing outside the exchange, the first moments might have looked almost uneventful. Then the distance changed. Lee moved in. Norris responded. The movement ended before it became a full attack. Then the pattern reversed. Norris tested the range. Lee adjusted. Neither man was giving the other a clean opportunity. This was the part of sparring that rarely survives in popular stories. Prefer the decisive moment. Experienced fighters know that decisive moments are usually created by dozens of smaller decisions. The position of the feet, the angle of the body, the direction of the eyes, the willingness to wait half a second longer. A fighter can appear passive while actually controlling the conditions of an exchange. Lee was particularly skilled at creating this uncertainty that his movement did not always announce what would happen next. He could remain relaxed until the moment a change became necessary. That economy was one of the qualities that made his training unusual. He did not need to make every movement dramatic. The less he moved, the more important each movement became. Norris presented a different problem. He was not inexperienced. He had spent years fighting men who understood distance and timing. He knew how to maintain balance and how to avoid being drawn into an opponent's preferred rhythm. That meant Lee could not simply rely on surprise. He had to adapt, and adaptation was central to the way Lee approached combat. If a particular approach produced resistance, he changed the approach. If a movement became predictable, it lost value. If an opponent refused to respond as expected, the fighter had to abandon the expectation. This is where the session becomes more interesting than the later question of who supposedly won. The two men were testing principles. Lee was not demonstrating a magic technique. Norris was not waiting to be defeated. They were both trying to discover what the other fighter would do when the first plan stopped working. The pace remained controlled. There was no need for reckless contact. The purpose of sparring between experienced practitioners is not to prove that one man can hurt another. It is to create enough resistance that weaknesses become visible. A partner who offers no resistance teaches very little. A partner who attacks without control teaches something else entirely. The useful middle ground is difficult to maintain. It requires discipline from both people. As the exchange continued, the room would have become increasingly focused on small changes. A step that came slightly earlier, a guard that shifted, a kick that forced a retreat, a hand movement that interrupted an expected line. These moments were brief, but brief does not mean insignificant. In martial arts, a fraction of a second can determine whether an attack reaches its target or passes through empty space. This was where Lee's reputation for speed became less important than the intelligence behind it. Speed was useful because it allowed him to exploit openings. It was not the opening itself. Norris's strengths and kicking ability were equally dependent on timing. Power mattered only when it could be delivered under the right conditions. That is why neither man's reputation could settle the question beforehand. A famous fighter's abilities exist in relation to another fighter. The same technique can produce completely different results against different opponents. The exchange therefore became a conversation without words. Lee changed something. Norris answered. Norris changed something. Lee answered. The observers could see the adjustments, even if they could not always understand why they were happening. And gradually, the character of the session began to change. At the beginning, the two men had been measuring each other. Now they were forcing each other to think. That distinction mattered. A fighter who is merely reacting can eventually become overwhelmed by the number of decisions required. A fighter who remains calm can turn those decisions into information. Lee had spent much of his martial arts life studying that problem. How little movement could accomplish the necessary result? How quickly could a fighter recognize what was actually happening? How much of traditional technique remained useful when the opponent refused to cooperate? Those questions were no longer theoretical. They were standing directly in front of him. And Norris was not merely the subject of the experiment. He was participating in it. That is what made their relationship unusual. Neither man needed the other to validate his reputation. The value came from resistance, from having someone capable of exposing an assumption. The room remained quiet. No one needed to announce who was ahead. There was no scoreboard. The witnesses were watching the adjustments instead. And eventually, according to the way these encounters have been remembered, there came a point when the observers stopped thinking of the session as a comparison between two famous martial artists. Something more subtle had happened. One fighter had begun adapting to the other, then the other adapted again. The contest had become a study in timing, economy, and control, and that was precisely when the psychological dimension of the encounter began to reveal itself. Because once two accomplished fighters realize that neither can simply impose his preferred rhythm, the question changes. It is no longer, who is stronger? It becomes, who can remain composed when the situation stops behaving as expected? That question was about to become the most important one in the room. The most important moment in a sparring session is not always the moment when someone falls. Sometimes, it is the moment when both fighters understand something at the same time. The exchange between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris had reached that stage. Whatever precise details later accounts attached to the encounter, the larger pattern is consistent with what experienced practitioners understand about controlled sparring. The longer the capable fighters work against each other, the less useful reputation becomes. A championship title cannot block a kick. A famous name cannot create distance. Experience does not remove the need to react. Everything eventually returns to movement, and movement reveals things. Lee's approach depended heavily on economy. He was interested in doing only what was necessary, removing unnecessary motion and responding to the opponent rather than forcing a predetermined sequence. Norris had spent years developing his own form of efficiency through competition. His techniques had to work against people who were actively attempting to prevent them from working. The two approaches were different, but neither was careless. That was why the exchange had become difficult to reduce to a simple victory. One of the dangers in remembering martial arts history is that people often reconstruct private training as though it were a championship bout. They expect a final blow, a stunned crowd, a clear winner, but training does not always provide those things. Sometimes the most meaningful result is recognition. A fighter recognizes that a particular movement is more difficult to read than expected. Another recognizes that an opponent's apparent opening is not really an opening. A third possibility appears. Respect. Not the polite respect given after a public demonstration. Something more practical. The respect of knowing that the person standing across from you can make your mistakes matter. That kind of respect does not require defeat. It can emerge precisely because neither fighter is easily defeated. For Norris, Lee's unusual rhythm presented a different problem from the opponent's. He normally encountered in competition. Lee could change pace quickly. He could move without appearing tense. He could make a small adjustment and suddenly occupy a different relationship to distance. For Lee, Norris represented a different kind of challenge. Norris was not simply fast enough to be interesting. He was experienced enough to recognize patterns. That meant Lee could not depend on novelty forever. Eventually, Norris would begin to understand the rhythm, and once an opponent begins understanding the rhythm, the advantage of surprise becomes smaller. Lee had to adapt again. This is perhaps the most revealing aspect of the story. Mastery did not appear as perfect control over another person. It appeared as the willingness to change. The exchange continued without either man needing to demonstrate everything he knew. There was restraint. That restraint is important, because it separates serious training from spectacle. A fighter who wants to prove himself may continue attacking after the useful lesson has already been learned. A fighter who understands training knows when enough information has been gathered. That principle would become increasingly visible in Lee's own philosophy. He was interested in combat as a living process. A technique had value only when it remained adaptable. A style had value only when it served the practitioner. And strength had value only when it could be controlled. The people watching would not necessarily have described it in those terms. They would have noticed simpler things. The room was quieter than before. The movements had become more deliberate. There was less experimentation and more recognition. The fighters were no longer asking the same questions. They were beginning to understand the answers. That is where psychological pressure enters a sparring session. Not through fear, not through intimidation, through uncertainty. A fighter becomes uncomfortable when he realizes that the opponent cannot be easily predicted, and uncertainty can produce mistakes. The instinct is to move more. To attack sooner. To force the situation back into familiar territory. But against a calm opponent, that reaction can create the opening you were trying to prevent. Lee's method often relied on refusing that temptation. There was no need to chase. No need to make every exchange decisive. If the opponent created distance, distance could be accepted. If the opponent changed rhythm, the rhythm could be studied. The fighter who remains patient often sees more, and patience was particularly important in a room where both men already knew they possessed physical ability. Neither had to prove that he could strike. The question was whether he could remain disciplined. When the exchange became uncertain, that is why the supposed outcome of the encounter has been debated for so long. People want a winner because a winner makes a cleaner story. But the historical relationship between Lee and Norris suggests something less dramatic and more revealing. They were training partners. They learned from each other. They respected each other's abilities, and the value of their encounters came from that exchange. The famous idea that exactly 11 witnesses watched a secret match may have grown through later storytelling. But the underlying image remains powerful for a reason. A small room. 2 Accomplished fighters. No public audience. No championship belt. No need for applause. Only the uncomfortable honesty of another skilled practitioner standing close enough to expose what theory cannot. Eventually, the session had to end. There was no reason to force a dramatic conclusion. The useful information had already been gathered. The fighters could step away without one having to announce victory over the other. And perhaps that was the part the witnesses remembered most clearly. Nothing needed to be declared. The atmosphere had changed because everyone in the room had seen the same basic truth. Two very different approaches could meet without one being reduced to the other's shadow. Lee's speed had not made Norris irrelevant. Norris's strength and competitive experience had not made Lee's ideas meaningless. Instead, each had forced the other to become more precise. That is a much quieter form of dominance. It is not domination over another person, it is domination over one's own assumptions. And that lesson would remain relevant long after the room had emptied. The sparring session itself would eventually disappear into memory, but the relationship between the two men would continue to influence how martial artists discussed speed, timing, adaptability, and practical training. Years later, people would still ask, who won? The more revealing question was what both men learned, because when two accomplished fighters finished training without needing to humiliate one another, the result cannot be measured only by who landed the better technique. Sometimes the result is visible only afterward. In the way one fighter changes his training, in the way another describes his former partner, and in the quiet respect that survives when the need to prove something has disappeared. That was the part of the encounter that could not be captured by a scoreboard, and it was the part that lasted. Chapter 6. What survived after the sparring ended? The room eventually became ordinary again. The floor was cleared, the equipment was put away. The people who had watched returned to their own training. There was no championship ceremony, no official result, no record that could settle every detail of what had happened. That absence would become important, because when an event has no official conclusion, memory begins to do the work that accords normally perform. Over the years, stories about Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris training together became increasingly dramatic. Some versions described a secret match. Others added precise numbers, particular exchanges, or a clearly defined outcome. The claim that exactly 11 people witnessed one secret sparring match belongs to that larger tradition of martial arts storytelling. It should not be presented as established fact. What remains much more defensible is simpler. Lee and Norris knew each other. They trained together. They respected one another. And their relationship existed during a period when martial arts in America was beginning to change. That historical context gives the encounter its lasting significance. Bruce Lee would not live long enough to see the full effect of his influence. His death in 1973 transformed him from an active martial artist into something larger in public memory. Chuck Norris continued. He remained involved in martial arts, teaching, competition, and later popular culture. Their paths separated, but the contrast between them remained useful to people trying to understand what martial arts could become. Lee represented experimentation. Norris represented disciplined, competitive experience. Neither description is complete on its own. Lee was also disciplined. Norris was also capable of adapting. The important point is that both men understood that martial arts could not survive as an abstract idea. It had to work against another person. That was the real value of training together. A fighter could spend years practicing a technique in isolation and become convinced that the technique was perfect. Another person could destroy that confidence in seconds, not through cruelty, through resistance. That is why serious martial artists often seek training partners who are difficult to predict. A cooperative partner allows technique to remain comfortable. A challenging partner forces adjustment. An adjustment was central to Lee's development. His later philosophy would become associated with ideas of adaptability, directness, and freedom from unnecessary limitation. Those concepts are often quoted today as if they were slogans, but their origin was much more physical. They emerged from training, from seeing what worked, from seeing what failed, from changing something and testing it again. That process is difficult to romanticize, because it is repetitive. There is no single moment when mastery suddenly arrives. There are thousands of small corrections. A stance becomes slightly better, a movement becomes shorter, a reaction becomes faster, an unnecessary motion disappears, and gradually the practitioner becomes more difficult to surprise. Training with someone like Norris could contribute to that process. Norris had developed his own understanding through years of competition. He knew the demands of fighting under pressure and the importance of maintaining composure when another skilled practitioner attempted to impose his rhythm. the relationship. Therefore, it represented something more useful than rivalry. It represented feedback. 2. Men could step onto a floor with different assumptions and discover that reality was more complicated than either assumption. That is the part of the story that tends to disappear when the encounter is turned into a contest. The question, who won, is easy to remember. The question, what changed afterward, is much harder. Yet the second question matters more, because winning a private sparring session changes very little. Learning something that permanently alters the way you train can change a lifetime. The martial arts community surrounding Lee and Norris was small enough that information traveled through people. Students remembered what instructors demonstrated. Practitioners repeated stories. Witnesses described what they had seen. Sometimes the details became sharper with every retelling, even when the original memory had become less certain. That is how legends grow, not necessarily because someone deliberately invents a story, sometimes because a real event is remembered by many people from different angles. One person remembers the speed, another remembers the technique, another remembers the atmosphere, another remembers what was said afterward. Eventually, those fragments become one story. The story of Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris has survived in exactly that environment. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy is not the private sparring itself. It is what both men represented to generations that followed. Lee demonstrated that a martial artist could question tradition without disrespecting the people who came before him. Norris demonstrated that disciplined practice and competitive experience could produce a level of skill that required no theatrical explanation. Together, they became part of a larger transition. Martial arts were moving beyond closed communities. They were becoming international. Films, tournaments, demonstrations, schools, and television would bring different systems into contact with one another. The boundaries between styles would become less rigid, and the idea that practitioners could learn across those boundaries would become increasingly normal. Lee had already begun pushing in that direction. His influence would eventually extend far beyond the people who trained with him personally. Norris would carry his own influence forward through teaching and public life. Their careers became very different. Their legacies, however, remained connected. Whenever people discuss the martial arts of that period, the two names often return to the same conversation. Not because one defeated the other, because they showed two different ways of becoming formidable, and that distinction matters. There is a temptation to believe that mastery means eliminating uncertainty. The historical reality is almost the opposite. The more skilled the practitioner becomes, the more clearly he sees how much remains unknown. That may have been the quiet lesson inside those private training sessions. Neither Lee nor Norris needed to pretend that he had nothing left to learn. The strongest evidence of confidence is sometimes the willingness to test yourself against someone who can expose your weaknesses. Years after Lee's death, the stories continued. The witnesses grew older. Memories became less precise. The martial arts world changed. New champions appeared. New styles gained attention. New generations discovered Lee through films and discovered Norris through competition, teaching, and popular culture. But the image of the two men standing across from each other remained. It survived because it represented something people instinctively understand. Two highly capable individuals do not always need an enemy. Sometimes they need a mirror. Someone close enough in ability to reveal what cannot be seen alone. That is why History remains compelling, even without a confirmed winner. The absence of a definitive result does not weaken the encounter. In some ways, it explains its longevity. A knockout would have ended the story. A score would have settled it. A trophy would have reduced it to a statistic. Instead, there is uncertainty, and uncertainty leaves room for reflection, perhaps. The 11 witnesses existed exactly as the legend claims. Perhaps that number changed as the story passed from one person to another. History cannot responsibly pretend to know what the evidence does not.